My name is Sara. I'm a developer advocate on the Firebase team at Google. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Firebase before? Awesome, it looks like just about everybody. How many of you have used it in your application? Cool, okay. So today I'm going to tell you how you can use Firebase and Angular to build awesome applications. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. First I'm going to give an intro to what Firebase is. Then I'm going to talk about AngularFire, which is an Angular module that makes it really easy to wire up Firebase as the backend for your Angular application. And then we're going to do some live coding with Ionic. So to get started, the end user of your application expects a couple things. They expect that your app is going to be fast, and more, they're expecting that your app will work offline. If you lose network connection intermittently, they're going to expect that your app will still work. And they're also going to expect that your app works on different devices, on tablets, on desktop, on phones. And they'll want simple authentication, so they'll want to be able to authenticate with services that they're familiar with. And real-time feature-rich apps like this are here. One example is Google Docs, where you can see other people editing the document in real time. Another example is your Facebook news feed. But one thing that both of these apps have in common is that they're difficult to build. They require a lot of engineers. And they're difficult to scale. And so this is why we built Firebase. Firebase is a powerful platform for building extraordinary applications. And we wanted to make it a lot easier for you as a single developer or a team of small developers, a small team of developers, to be able to build apps like this really easily. So essentially, Firebase is your backend. I'm going to talk about each of these features more in depth. We have a real-time database that makes it really easy to store and sync data. We offer some authentication services, so you can authenticate users directly from the client. And then we also make it easy to secure your data, define who has read and write access at different nodes. And we have a static hosting service, so you can deploy your app from the command line with one command, Firebase deploy. So looking at the real-time database specifically, so Firebase is a NoSQL JSON data store. And every piece of data in Firebase is referenced by a URL. So you can also use it as a REST API. If you append .json to any URL, you'll get a RESTful response back. And a really cool thing about Firebase is that whenever data is updated in your Firebase, it sends that update down to every connected client. So anyone that has your application open, they don't need to pull to refresh. They'll receive all of the data updates immediately. Here's kind of a demo of how it works. So as you can see, multiple clients connected to this single Firebase database. They're all receiving updates in real time. And now I'm going to show you how this works using our JavaScript SDK. So the way you create a reference to your data in Firebase is you say var ref equals new Firebase, and you pass it a URL. So I'm actually going to go to this URL. I've already got it open here. And I'm using, I'll refresh the page to make sure internet is good. I'm using a demo server. We have a demo server that lets you just create a Firebase on the fly. So any of you can actually go to this URL and try to mess with my demo if you'd like. So I've created a reference to my Firebase. And one way to write data to Firebase is through our set method. So what this does is it'll take any string, object, number, Boolean you pass it, and it'll update the contents of that location with whatever you pass it. So I'm going to pull up the console here. I'm going to clear this out, and I'm going to create a reference to this Firebase. Var ref equals new Firebase. I'm passing it the URL. Now I've got a reference to my Firebase, and now I'm going to use set. I'm going to say ref.set. Hello, everyone. And you can see it updates here. And if any of you were to pull up this page and do the same thing in your console, we would see it change. So with set, the last write wins. If you've got a situation where there's a lot of people writing to the same node at the same time, you'll want to use a method called push, which will generate a unique ID for every piece of data that's added in Firebase. So if I go in here and say ref.push, hello, somebody changed it. Someone cleared it out. Look at that. So I said ref.push, hello, it added a new piece of data. If I go ahead and run that again, you can see it's creating this unique ID based on a timestamp every time a new piece of data is added. So that's kind of the basics of writing data to Firebase. Someone else is adding some data. Feel free to keep it coming. To read data back from Firebase, you just attach an asynchronous callback to your Firebase reference. So this is saying ref.onValue. Anytime the value at this location changes, this callback function will be called. It returns a snapshot, which is essentially a snapshot of your data at that point in time. And here we're just logging it to the console. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it in. And you can see this, it's returning this object, which is the value of the Firebase. Do I get a free t-shirt? We can chat after. I'll make sure you get a Firebase shirt, whoever wrote that. So the cool thing is if I come in here and change this to say hi instead, we can see that that callback was triggered again, and I didn't have to write any extra code to make that happen. So this is going to be logged to the console anytime the data at this location changes. So that's kind of the basics of reading and writing data in Firebase. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we handle intermittent offline situations. So what happens when you're using a chat app on your phone and you go through a tunnel? So all of this data is going to be stored in Firebase locally, and the app will continue to work for you as a user that's using an app that goes offline. You'll see all of your chat messages appear while you're offline. And then when you reconnect, you'll see all of your data will be sent to the Firebase servers, and then you'll see any updates that you missed while you were offline. So let's do a quick demo of this. I'm going to open a new tab with the Firebase that I owned. I'm actually going to pull this up in 2 tabs. And I'm going to pull up the console here. And first, I'm going to just create a reference to this Firebase. Oops. And I'm going to do that on both sides. There we go. OK, so the first thing I'm going to do is on the left side, I'm just going to say ref.push message 1. Oops, there we go. We can see that it's displayed in real time in both clients. Nothing offline specific going on yet. Over here, I'm going to say ref.push message 2. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a method called go offline. I'm going to disconnect the right side. So if we have a method called firebase.goOffline, which will manually disconnect the client from the server. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the right side. And now I'm going to say ref.push message 3. And you'll see that it was added here, even though this client is offline. And obviously, it didn't sync yet, because this client is still connected. And now I'm going to say ref.push message 4. I'm going to go over here and say ref.push message 5. Remember, the left side is connected. I'm going to say ref.push message 6. So now we've got a bunch of messages. Some were written while we were offline. And now I'm going to go back over here to the right side and say firebase.goOnline. And you'll see as it reconnected, all the messages were slotted appropriately based on the time that they were sent. So that's kind of a quick demo of how offline works in the Firebase JavaScript SDK. Oh, somebody added a smiley face. So nice. Back to the slides. So authentication in Firebase is super simple. We support several forms of authentication. You can authenticate users using email and password. We also support a number of third-party providers, so Google, Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and you can also do anonymous authentication. Authentication is really easy to do with Firebase, and it even supports custom backends. This is a quick code snippet of how you authenticate users in your Firebase. So you create a reference, and by including the Firebase JavaScript library, you have access to this method called auth with OAuth popup. And you just pass it the name of the provider you're using. In this example, we're using Twitter. And when the user authenticates, it'll return an object with a bunch of user data. And Firebase also makes security really easy. Our security rules use a JavaScript-like syntax, and you can define 3 types of rules, read, write, and validate, that defines who has access to your data at different nodes. And if you're using Firebase's authentication, this works really well, because you automatically get access to an auth variable in your security rules. So you can do things like say only logged in users can write data to this node. So in this example, we're saying anybody can read the data. Under our users node, I'm using a $ variable here, which specifies a dynamic path. So any child of users, to write to it, you need to be authenticated as the user that you say you are. That's a quick demo of how our security works. We have cross-platform SDKs. So the demo I showed you before was using our JavaScript SDK for the web. If you're a native mobile developer, we also have iOS and Android SDKs. And we also have a number of bindings for front-end frameworks. But you're all here because you love Angular, so I'm going to skip right to the next slide. Talk about AngularFire. So AngularFire is an Angular module that provides synchronized collections and authentication services. It makes it really easy to wire up Firebase as the backend for your Angular application. To get started, you just need to include the dependencies. So you need to include Firebase and AngularFire, and then inject the AngularFire services into your app. We have 3 services, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of them. The first is Firebase Array, which provides a synchronized collection. And this uses our push method, which I showed you before under the hood. And what this does is it keeps your local Angular array in sync with all of your remote Firebase data. So Angular expects everything to be an array. Firebase array will handle synchronizing this with the data in your Firebase with all of the data in your local Angular application. It's really useful for when you have lists of data where there's a lot of data changing frequently. Here's a quick snippet of using Firebase array. So Firebase array takes a Firebase reference. So once I've defined my Firebase reference, I can create a Firebase array, and then I will use the AngularFire specific method $add to add data to that array. And then this is what it's going to look like when it's stored in Firebase. You can see that this unique ID will be created whenever you use $add. Firebase object I'll touch on quickly. It's used for storing synchronized key value pairs, so storing any type of data that's not a collection. So user profile data is probably a good example of this. It's data that's not going to be changing frequently. A quick demo, so I'm creating a reference to some user profile data for myself. Let's say I already have a bunch of other data in there and I want to add some data on my favorite song, which is Chicken Fried. It's a good song. I recommend you check it out if you haven't already. And I'm using $save to save that to Firebase. And then all of my data in Firebase will look like this. So it'll add it to all of the user profile data that was there before. And then the last service I want to talk about is Firebase Auth, which lets you use all of Firebase's authentication methods directly from your AngularFire application. You can authenticate users using only client-side code. And as I mentioned before, we support email password login and a number of third-party providers. This is how Firebase Auth works, similar to the auth example I showed before. So once you've created your Firebase Auth, you can use the method auth with OAuth popup, and then just pass it the name of the provider that you're authenticating with. So now let's write some code. In my live coding, I'm going to use Ionic. So Ionic is an awesome hybrid application framework. How many of you are familiar with Ionic? Cool. So Firebase is a great way to store data for your Ionic application. We're going to build a social, mobile, local chat application. So I'm going to hop on over here to Sublime. Can everybody see that? I'll make it just a tad bigger. How's that? Good for everybody? OK, so I'm using the Ionic CLI here. And what I did is I just generated a blank application template and added a couple of things to it. So to show you guys what this looks like, I'm going to use the command ionic serve --lab. And what this does is opens the app in the browser with a side-by-side iOS and Android view. It's a pretty cool Ionic CLI feature. So here I've just got a basic chat application. It pops up a modal to add a message. But right now it doesn't do anything because I haven't written the code for that yet. So this is what we're working with. Let's look at my template. So I wrapped everything in an Ion pane. I've got this header bar, which just says Ionic chat. And then when you click on the chat bubble, it'll show the modal. And then once we have chat messages, I'm using ngRepeat to loop through them, sort them by time, and then it'll display the name and the text from the message. And then here's the modal. And one thing to note is when this modal form is submitted, it calls this add message function and passes it the current chat message. We haven't written that add message function yet. So if I go into app.js here, most of this was generated automatically for me when I created the blank application template. The only things I added were these three functions right here. All this does is creates the modal and opens it and closes it when I click on that chat bubble and the close button. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to store all the chat messages in a local Angular array. I'm not going to use Firebase to get started. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say scope.messages equals an empty array. And then I need to write that add message function, which is called over here. So I pass it the message. The first thing I want to do is add a time property to that. So I'm just going to say new date.getTime. Because remember, in my template, I'm displaying all the messages in order of the time that they were sent. And then I'm going to say scope.messages.push. I'm going to pass it the message. And then I just want to close the modal. So I'm going to say message modal.hide. So now if I go back here and I add a message, you can see that it was added here. But it wasn't added on this client. And this is because it's only being stored locally. And you'll notice that if I refresh the page, my chat message disappears, which is kind of sad because it's a chat application. We should be able to see all the chat history. So now I'm going to wire up Firebase to this application, show you guys how easy it is to use AngularFire. The first thing I want to do is I need to include the dependencies. So I'm just going to go in here, right above my app.js file. I'm including the latest versions of Firebase and AngularFire. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then in here, I just need to add Firebase as a dependency in my global application module. And since this is a chat app, we're going to have a lot of people writing messages pretty frequently. So I'm going to use Firebase array. So I'm going to inject Firebase array into my controller. And remember before I told you that Firebase array takes a Firebase reference. So I'm going to go in here and create that reference. I'm just going to say var_ref equals new Firebase. I'm going to use my Angular chat Firebase for this. And I'm actually going to go to that URL in the browser and make sure that I deleted my data from before. There we go. So let me just remove the data from my offline demo. There we go. So it's empty because we haven't added any chat message data yet. I'm going to go back to my application. And instead of using an empty array here, I'm going to use a Firebase array. And I'm going to pass it this reference that we just created here. And so now all I need to do is instead of using push, I'm going to want to use the AngularFire specific method $add. And then one last thing I want to do is just clear that text field after the message is saved to Firebase. So let's go over here to the application. Let's add a new message. We can see that it's displayed on both sides. And if I open this up side by side with Firebase, and I'm going to go ahead and add a new message, say hi again, we can see that it was also added to Firebase. So this is pretty cool. Just a couple lines of code, and we've got all of our chat data being persisted in Firebase. But right now, I'm just chatting with myself over here, which isn't very fun. So what I want to do is use Firebase hosting to deploy this application. Now, since I'm using Ionic, I typically would want to publish this to the iOS or Android app stores. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to deploy it so we'll be able to open it up in a mobile browser, and it'll look really good. So I'm going to go over here to my command line. I'm going to quit out of this and clear that. And I've already installed the Firebase command line tools. To do that, you just need to do npm install-g firebase-tools. And so I'll make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to run the command firebase init. And this is asking me the name of the Firebase I'd like to use for hosting. I've got a bunch of Firebase apps, as you can see, but I'm just going to use the one for this demo, which is AngularU-chat. And now it's asking me the directory I want to deploy. My index.html lives in the www directory in my Ionic application. So that's the directory that I'm always going to want to deploy. So I'm going to enter that here. And I'll only ever have to run this Firebase init command once. Now my application is ready to deploy. Anytime I run the command Firebase deploy, it'll know to deploy my www directory. So now let's deploy this app, Firebase deploy. There it goes. And boom, my app is live. If I want to open it in the browser, I can just run the command Firebase open. You guys can all take out your phones and chat with each other and try it out. And we'll see all of your chat messages displayed in real time. The URL is angularu-chat.firebaseapp.com, if you didn't get that. While you're jumping into the chat, I'm going to, oh, someone's already in here. Awesome. Lots of people want t-shirts. We have a lot of t-shirts. I'm going to go back to my slides. So documentation is really important. We've got some great documentation on getting started with Angular, and then we also have some Firebase-specific documentation. To get to it, just go to these URLs. I'm going to open it up really quick here so you guys can see what it looks like. So we have a guide on getting started with Ionic and Firebase. We also have a guide for getting started with Angular and Firebase. It goes into detail on all of the AngularFire methods that I demoed previously. A little bit more data on Firebase. We have just over 204,000 registered developers using our platform. This number here is actually a real-time counter. So if any of you sign up for Firebase while I'm on this slide, it will update in real time, and it'll be really exciting. We've got 1 million concurrent users on Firebase sites at any given time. So this means that any site, any developer that's built an application with Firebase, our servers are handling over 1 million concurrents across those sites at any given time. And we joined Google in October of 2014. Here are a couple examples of Firebase applications in production. Twitch TV uses Firebase to power their chat and also to notify users when real-time streams go live. Citrix is using Firebase for the presence feature in the web version of GoToMeeting, so to notify people when users join and leave a video chat. Citrix also uses us to power an application called Talkboard. It's an iPad app that lets you do real-time collaborative drawing across teams. CBS is using Firebase to power the chat stream for Big Brother. It's a TV show that happens every summer. Basically a place for fans to log on and chat with each other while the show is happening. This handles about 50,000 concurrents, all powered by Firebase at peak times during the show. And then Warby Parker is using Firebase in one of their New York stores when you order a pair of glasses. It's a glasses company. When you order some glasses, they'll be shot down to you to the cash register through pneumatic tubes, and Firebase powers those tubes. So to conclude, Firebase's goal is to let you as a developer focus on your application and creating an awesome user experience. Ultimately, the user doesn't care how many databases you have in your application behind the scenes. All that they care about is that your app is easy to use, it's fast, and enjoyable, and Firebase can help you with that. So to summarize, I started out by talking about what Firebase is, then gave an intro to AngularFire, then we did some live coding with Ionic. Hopefully you're all chatting with each other. And I'm happy to take any questions in the hallway track, so I'll be around for the rest of the day if you guys have questions, or I can take any questions now. You can find me on Twitter at srobtweets, also, if you guys have any questions after today.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes left, so